How is it possible that a Pokemon with a maximum of 1 HP became not only relevant in competitive play, but a top threat? Moreover, how did it happen twice in 2 different generations of Pokemon 3 years apart? Many of you probably think that you know the answer already, because the only Pokemon with 1 HP is Shedinja, a Pokemon with a powerful and unique ability called Wonder Guard that negates much of the damage it would otherwise take. There we go, case closed, problem solved. I'm good at making videos, is what I would say if this video sucked, because Shedinja's broken ability is only one part of what allowed it to rise to such prominence. Then again, it is the most important part, so why don't we give it a closer look. Wonder Guard negates all direct damage done to Shedinja by moves that are not super effective. In other words, if you're using an attacking move that's supposed to do damage, it will only work as intended if Shedinja is weak to the type of the move. Now, to be clear, if you could give any ability to any Pokemon, this would probably be the single strongest ability in the entire game. Given that you can't though, how good Wonder Guard is tied directly to how good Shedinja is as a Wonder Guard user. Shedinja is a bug and ghost type Pokemon, meaning it's only weak to 5 of the 18 types, under a third of the total type chart. Well, we have our answer then. Shedinja was good because it's only weak to a handful of types, and therefore all a player has to do to succeed with it is to get rid of the Pokemon knowing those types of moves. There we go, video closed. Except, remember how I said that Wonder Guard only protects Shedinja from direct damage? Well, not every move in Pokemon is an attack. Some moves are classified as status moves, and Wonder Guard doesn't do anything to stop status moves. For example, Toxic is a poison type move, and Shedinja isn't weak to poison. However, it will still inflict the badly poison status on Shedinja, causing it to lose a percentage of its HP every single turn, and that percentage happens to be 100%, because with only 1 HP, any passive damage dealt to Shedinja will immediately knock it out due to Pokemon's HP not dealing with numbers smaller than 1. Poison's not the only thing that our spooky bug has to watch out for. Burn is the more popular status condition, though it isn't as dangerous as going outside. By which I mean weather. Sandstorm and Hail, which existed prior to Scarlet and Violet's change to Snow, deal passive damage to every Pokemon without a typing protecting them at the end of each turn. Shedinja, as you probably know, isn't safe from either weather condition. And unlike damaging moves, can't use Protect to save itself for a turn because weather is a field effect, not an attack that can be blocked. Now, if you're like Shedinja and are a little scared of the weather outside, do I have the game for you? This video's sponsor, Zenless Zone Zero. Zenless Zone Zero is a high-octane urban fantasy action RPG, currently celebrating their 2-year anniversary with the version 3.1 update. As part of the anniversary celebrations, all players can receive a ton of rewards, including 1 free selectable limited S-tier agent. I think I'll be going for Jane Doe, because I wouldn't be where I am today without a good rat. You'll also be able to get a selectable S-tier W engine, 20 character signal search polls, 10 Bang Boo signal search polls, 1,760 polychromes, and a costume for Lucy. All for free. This is the most reward the game has ever given away for free at once, so it's an amazing time for new players and returning players to get into the game. Version 3.1 also introduces new characters, including first generation Void Hunter Ramila, who wields a multi-form lightsaber. She has 2 forms. She can be your Angle or your Devil. There's also an awesome new permanent combat mode called Operation Bagel. Did you know I once ate 5 bagels in 24 hours? Now that's what I call Operation Bagel. But in Zenless Zone Zero's version of Operation Bagel, you can dive deep into the Papago Hollow and search for increasingly valuable loot, and you decide when it's time to extract. Whether you're brand new or coming back to Zenless Zone Zero, now is the perfect time to dive in. You can download the game at the link in the description and use the redeem code ZZZ31Ramila for 60 polychromes and 6666 Denny's. Thanks again to Zenless Zone Zero for sponsoring this video. Okay. Well, let's say that you're facing an opponent without any nasty status moves and only 1 or 2 Pokemon that can damage it with super effective attacks. Surely then it would be a devastating threat, right? Well, if you can get rid of your opponent's only ways to damage it, then yes, Shedinja should win you the game. Here's the thing though, Shedinja might not help you do that. Let's take a look at the stats of the Route 1 bird Pokemon from Generation 3, Halo, the pre-evolution to be clear. It has a base stat total of 270. That is very low, like extremely low, but that's okay because nobody expects Halo to be good. Anyway, for no particular reason, let's take a look at Shedinja's stats. My God, 236? Okay, wait, that's gotta be misleading since Shedinja only has 1 HP, right? Let's pretend that Shedinja had a good base HP stat like 100, but even still, it's only at 335. Ugh. To give you an idea of just how low Shedinja's stats are, let's take a look at Primal Groudon. I'm talking about Primal Groudon here not only because it has more stats than Arceus, but because it's going to become very relevant in a second. Anyway, you can multiply all of Shedinja's stats by 3 and you still wouldn't have as many points as one Primal Groudon. This bad boy can fit so many Shedinjas inside of it, baby. Shedinja's been legal in the vast majority of rule sets all the way from the birth of modern competitive Pokemon in 2008 up until the end of Sword and Shield in 2022, which was also its last appearance in a mainline game. But for the vast majority of those years, it saw almost exactly 0 usage. Would you like to guess what the first year was where Shedinja realized its potential and became a top threat? Did you guess 2009? If you did, that's not the answer I'm looking for, but Shedinja did actually place second at the World Championships that year. It even has an amazing 1 against 3 in Game 2 of the finals where it completely walls the foe's team. The real answer as to its mainstream usage was, however, 2019. This final year of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon allowed powerful, normally banned, restricted Pokemon, which makes it seem a bit weird that we're talking about Shedinja. After all, you would expect that a Pokemon with the single worst stats of any Pokemon to ever see competitive use would need a lower power level format to succeed rather than a higher one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What you need to know about 2019 is that it was defined by its legendary restricted Pokemon, and specifically by 3 restricted Pokemon: Kyogre, Groudon, and, you guessed it, Xerneas. These were not the only viable or even the only good restricted Pokemon, but they were the most important. Xerneas is the single strongest Pokemon ever made, with its signature move Geomancy able to immediately double 3 out of 4 of its most important stats. After setting up, few Pokemon could withstand its onslaught or remove it quickly. So much of competitive play centered around preventing Xerneas from setting up or somehow stopping it once it did. Groudon and Kyogre, by contrast, didn't need to use a setup move to do ridiculous damage. With the special primal forms they were given the generation prior, they received enormous base stat increases, as well as new abilities that improved the potency of their weather abilities. Rather than setting sun and rain up like their base forms, these ancient beasts set desolate land and primordial sea, enhanced forms of weather with additional effects, in addition to the original effects that sun and rain provide. Understanding these 3 Pokemon is key to understanding just how Shedinja was able to be such a terrifying threat. Xerneas is the simplest to break down, with Geomancy doubling its stats and its ability Fairy Aura further powering up its fairy type moves. Xerneas had no need for coverage moves. All it needed to rip through the majority of the format was 2 fairy attacks, in Moonblast for burst damage and Dazzling Gleam for spread damage. But Xerneas couldn't rip through all of the format, because the strongest Pokemon of all time is completely incapable of dealing even a single point of damage to one tiny bug. Primal Groudon and Kyogre are the more interesting Pokemon to analyze because they have quite a few interesting synergies with Shedinja. First is the fact that their primordial weather is far stronger than normal weather, and that means that it isn't capable of being overwritten by normal weather. The way that weather traditionally works is that after being set up by an ability or a move, it'll last for 5 turns or until another weather overwrites it. Primordial weather is different. It lasts forever as long as an ability user is present on the field, and it cannot be overwritten by anything other than another primordial weather. What this means is that the use of both sand and hail, the 2 weather conditions without a primal form, dropped to 0 when Primal Groudon and Kyogre were present, given that they had no way to contend for weather control. So the first synergy is this. One of the easiest ways of getting rid of Shedinja via passive damaging weather was cancelled out by the presence of the primals in the format. The second synergy has to do with how Shedinja matches up against Primal Kyogre. Primal Kyogre was one of the single scariest attackers in the format, due to its powerful spread water moves, Origin Pulse and Water Spout, in addition to its coverage moves of Ice Beam and Thunder. Water, Ice, Electric, wait a second, none of these types can damage Shedinja, hello? So Shedinja was fully immune to 2 of the best restricted Pokemon in the format, and that's pretty good. But these Pokemon are even stronger than usual, and we've already established that Shedinja is quite weak. Does being immune even matter? As it turns out, yeah, it does, and quite a lot at that. You may be surprised to hear that in 2019, Shedinja was almost exclusively paired with Primal Groudon. This is surprising because it has more obvious synergy with Primal Kyogre, due to Kyogre's Primordial Sea causing all fire moves to fizzle out and do 0 damage, eliminating one of Shedinja's weaknesses. Why then was Shedinja paired with Groudon? Because of the Weather War interaction. See, Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre are both capable of destroying one another, but they both really prefer to fight in their weather. Kyogre can one-shot any and all Primal Groudon due to its quadruple weakness to water moves. But if Groudon's Desolate Land is active, water moves evaporate, dealing 0 damage. It flips the matchup entirely on its head. Of course, Primal Kyogre players knew this and worked hard to get Kyogre facing off against Groudon in the rain. With Groudon on the field and Kyogre's ridiculous base stats, even Pokemon that resisted water moves couldn't comfortably switch in without suffering huge losses, while you struggled to reposition your Groudon and reclaim the weather. And this is where Shedinja comes in. Because Shedinja doesn't resist water moves, it is fully immune to them. If you found yourself stuck with Groudon on the field in the rain, all you had to do was protect your partner and bring in Shedinja, ensuring that you take 0 damage from Kyogre for the turn, and setting yourself up to bring Groudon in again safely on the following turn. Shedinja could play a similar role versus Xerneas, as you would often have one Pokemon on the field that did not want to take a boosted Moonblast or Dazzling Gleam. Even if it wasn't doing any damage, being able to save your more important Pokemon while you dealt with a threat was a valuable asset in this super high power format. Again, Shedinja pairs well with Primal Groudon here because Primal Groudon was one of the few restricted Pokemon that actually could duel Xerneas. If you paired it with Shedinja, you had 2 Pokemon that could feasibly take Xerneas' attacks. Of course, Shedinja could do more than just stall. While it is true that it isn't able to use its offensive stats to be especially threatening against the powerful restricted Pokemon, it's still a Pokemon that you couldn't afford to ignore. Back in Generation 7, Shedinja had access to 2 especially dangerous status moves. The first I mentioned earlier, Toxic. With its gradually increasing poison damage at the end of each turn, it put a timer on even the bulkiest restricted Pokemon. So to avoid this, you want to get rid of the Shedinja quickly. But that's easier said than done. Even assuming that it didn't protect or switch out, there were 2 additional things that you had to worry about. The first is the Focus Sash item, which prevents a Pokemon from being knocked out by an attack if they had full HP, and leaves them with 1 HP while consuming the item. Since Shedinja only has 1 HP to begin with, this effectively means that it has an extra life. This is frustrating, but ultimately fair. Unlike the next tool that Shedinja had access to, which is just plain frustrating, Ally Switch. Ally Switch swaps the positions of your 2 Pokemon on the field. So if you tried to use Flare Blitz into Shedinja and Earth Power into Primal Groudon, if Shedinja used Ally Switch on this turn, you'd find your Flare Blitz hitting Groudon and Earth Power hitting Shedinja. It turned battles into this horrible guessing game, which is why the move was eventually nerfed in Generation 9, having a high chance to fail if used consecutively. But this is pre-nerf Ally Switch, and Shedinja could click it every single turn without consequence if it so pleased. All the while, Toxic is whittling away at your crucial Pokemon. But there was a saving grace, status moves. If you managed to burn or poison Shedinja, it would go down immediately, Focus Sash or otherwise. Have I mentioned the Tapus yet? There were 4 Tapus introduced in Sun and Moon, 3 of which were good and 1 of which was Bulu. These are legendary Pokemon with abilities that set terrain up when they were sent out, introducing an analog to the weather war raging between Groudon and Kyogre. These terrains did different things. Most powered up moves of a specific type, and all had an additional secondary effect. One of these secondary effects in particular was quite interesting, and it belonged to the Misty Terrain setting Tapu Fini. When Misty Terrain is active, it does 2 things for all Pokemon touching the ground. The first is it cuts the damage of all Dragon-type moves in half, and the second is that it protects all Pokemon from being inflicted with status conditions, such as Poison and Burn. It's worth noting that Tapu Fini was often paired with Primal Groudon already due to its excellent support kit and exceptional bulk, using moves like Icy Wind and Nature's Madness to disrupt opponents, and Haze to remove Xerneas' boosts and any Intimidate drops that landed on Groudon. So it wasn't a Pokemon you picked just to protect your Shedinja. Despite this, there was an even more brutal synergy when you combined the Clam and the Bug. Allow me to introduce one of the most threatening moves on this team. It may not do any damage, but Soak is the basis of some of the most nefarious strategies in the game. Soak overwrites the typing of whatever it hits and changes it to pure water. Normally it's used to set up for a surprise KO, like soaking an Incineroar and then KOing it in the same turn by using Leaf Storm. But what happens if you use Soak on Shedinja? Well, because it's a status move, Wonder Guard doesn't prevent it from working even though Shedinja isn't weak to water. It also doesn't fizzle out in the strong sunlight. And so, imagine you've been playing the entire game saving your Incineroar so that you can solo Shedinja at the end of the battle. You've played meticulously, sacrificing just the right Pokemon, and the end is in sight. All you need to do is hit Shedinja twice, and they use Soak. And just like that, the game is over. With water only being weak to grass and electric, Incineroar's Flare Blitz isn't quite cutting it anymore. Changing Shedinja's type at all would be brutal enough, but changing it to a type with only 2 weaknesses is especially evil. Now, it is true that Shedinja can't do damage quickly. Toxic takes time before it really adds up. So the more established players among you may be thinking that it could be possible to just eliminate the Pokemon that aren't Shedinja and then stall until the 20-minute timer hits 0. And you're right that this would have worked, except that the timer worked differently in Generation 7. And rather than the 20-minute game timer we have now, it was instead a 50-minute timer for the entire best of 3. Yeah, good luck stalling for 50 minutes against Toxic. Now, to be clear, Shedinja was not an overwhelmingly popular strategy. It was still risky, and it can be frustrating when it didn't work. I actually myself brought it to a regional championship where I finished 3rd, using Yveltal, Mega Gengar, and Incineroar to complete the Shedinja, Groudon, and Tapu Fini core. Despite the good finish, I didn't touch Shedinja again, finding it too volatile for my personal preferences. Not everybody agreed though, and actually, for some players, Shedinja became more than a Pokemon, it became a lifestyle. Let's look at one such player, Melvin Ke, the most successful Shedinja player of the format. At European Internationals, one of the biggest tournaments of the year, Melvin brought Shedinja all the way to a 3rd place, pairing his Shedinja core with Xerneas, Mega Salamence, and Incineroar. If you've seen my video about the Big 6 team that dominated play in the 2016 season, the core of Xerneas, Primal Groudon, and Mega Salamence might be familiar to you. Now combine the brutal offense of that trio with a near invincible Pokemon, and you get something truly horrifying to go up against. He followed this strong performance up with a top 8 at regionals, using the same team, and then a 5th place at North American Internationals, the final tournament before Worlds. At the World Championships, Melvin once again brought the same team of 6 Pokemon, and finished a spectacular top 16, just 1 place behind the best placing Shedinja. Following the World Championships, we continued to play this format until Sword and Shield released, and in that time, Shedinja won not 1, but 2 different regional championships. Oh yeah, one fact that I think is fun, it was actually optimal to run a Shedinja with intentionally lowered defense stats. Like, you'd have 0 IVs and a nature that lowered your defense. This is because you only had 1 HP anyway, so it's not like your defenses actually helped you. But if you played versus Ditto, which is a whole nother story that I'm not talking about right now, but was actually used a lot this year, they would copy all of your Shedinja's stats except for its HP. So they could have a Shedinja with 157 HP, and if that happened, you wanted to make it as easy as possible to get rid of them, since they were copying your defenses. Another known optimization is subscribing to this channel, to tell YouTube that you want more videos like this one, and so you can support the channel to make more of these videos in the first place. Many competitive players from 2019 abused both of these optimizations. Thus ended competitive play on Ultra Sun and Moon, Generation 7, and the 3DS era as a whole. But while you were down there clicking subscribe, you may have noticed that we still have about 8 minutes left in the video, if I had to guess. And that's because despite Sword and Shield being radically different games, Shedinja would rise to prominence once more 3 years later, in the final restricted Pokemon of Pokemon Sword and Shield in the year 2022. A lot can change in just 3 years. The primal Pokemon were no longer around, and Xerneas had, thankfully, fallen from grace due to the overwhelming presence of Zacian. Shedinja had lost several of its best tools itself, and yet it had a new niche to fill, new Pokemon to wall, including the best Pokemon in the game, Zacian. Sword and Shield Zacian was beyond a menace. With its ridiculous stats and the single best typing in the game, it would already have been excellent. But when you factored in its exceptional ability and powerful moves, including a signature move that dealt double damage to Dynamax Pokemon, it wasn't especially hard to understand how it ended up on 2/3 of all teams at that year's World Championships. Zacian would always run Protect, Behemoth Blade, and Sacred Sword to hit Incineroar and other steel types like Cartania. The last move was flexible, but tended to cycle between Play Rough, Swords Dance, Quick Attack, Wild Charge, and Substitute. And maybe you're noticing something about these moves. None of them can damage Shedinja. There were way more viable restricted Pokemon in Sword and Shield compared to Sun and Moon. But the simple fact of the matter is that most teams had a Zacian. Having a Pokemon that could completely wall Zacian was, to say the least, appealing. Not that Zacian was the only restricted Pokemon that Shedinja matched up well against. Just like last time, Kyogre found itself walled by Shedinja. Though it did have a new tool this time around to replace its primal form, but we'll get to that. But now, more restricted Pokemon found themselves struggling to remove the bug. Specifically, Palkia and Calyrex Ice Rider were a popular duo that went as far as top 4 at the World Championships, and neither ran a move that could damage Shedinja directly. With full immunity to 4 of the best 6 restricted Pokemon, Shedinja stood out as a Pokemon worth considering. But Shedinja still had value even if your opponent's restricted Pokemon could damage it due to its interaction with Dynamax. Dynamax was a once per battle mechanic that doubled your Pokemon's HP, gave most of their moves a power boost, and gave every single move a secondary effect that would trigger whenever they dealt damage. Importantly, Dynamax moves did damage through Protect, so you couldn't stop their secondary effects without some sort of an immunity. Wait a second. Stalling out your opponent's Dynamax while delaying your own was one of the most crucial skills of this era. And it was easier said than done, especially when staring down monstrous threats like Dynamax Kyogre and Dynamax Ice Rider. Wasting even one of your opponent's Dynamax moves could have a major impact as you deny them crucial stat boosts or damage. And for this, Shedinja was perfect. It's worth noting that even if Shedinja took a max move that dealt super effective damage, it could still be seen as a positive. Since all super effective moves deal the same amount of damage to Shedinja, wasting a max move was often super overkill compared to a Pokemon with more than 1 HP. With the Focus Sash, you could hit Shedinja with like Max Flare from Groudon and have it do literally 0 damage. Shedinja still often ran Ally Switch in this generation, and it wouldn't receive its nerf until Generation 9. So guessing wrong and targeting the wrong Pokemon when Shedinja Ally Switched could cost you 1, 2, or even 3 turns of your Dynamax. Now, Shedinja had a major new threat to worry about, and it also has to do with Dynamax. While many max moves raised your stats or lowered your foes, some set terrain up, and others changed the weather. Now, any Dynamax Pokemon with an Ice or Rock move could set up Hail or Sandstorm, provided they could hit something, and that would allow them to KO Shedinja at the end of the turn. Opposing Kyogre could turn their Ice Beam to max Hailstorm and try and KO Shedinja while damaging its partner. Of course, Ally Switch could throw a wrench into things, but Shedinja did still have to be careful of Kyogre in a way that it never had to before. In part because of this new weather interaction, Shedinja was no longer paired with Groudon but Kyogre. This is partially because Dynamax Kyogre can reset the rain with Max Geyser, which is the max move that it wants to click the most anyway, compared to regular Groudon who wants to click its ground type max move Max Quake instead of its fire one. Groudon was fine clicking Max Flare, but Max Quake was generally viewed as better. It's also in part because of the strength of the Sun teams of this era, and specifically Gigantamax Charizard, who would set up a passive effect that couldn't be removed and did massive damage at the end of every turn for 4 turns. Given how dangerous this was for Shedinja, it made sense to pick a restricted Pokemon that matched up well into Charizard to help combat it. The other restricted on these teams was Zacian. It was just too strong not to use, especially with Kyogre, who put a swift end to the scary fire and ground types that Zacian was weak to. Zacian also appreciated having Shedinja as a safe switch-in against opposing Zacian and Kyogre, and just in general to reset any drops from Intimidate. Incineroar was the only Pokemon used more than Zacian at this year's World Championships. Now, Shedinja lost access to Toxic and Sword and Shield, and so in addition to Protect, Shadow Sneak, and Ally Switch, it would often use the move Poltergeist. It's a powerful Ghost-type attack that can help set up for KOs from Zacian and Kyogre, and it gave Shedinja the ability to do more immediate damage compared to the Toxic set. This move didn't exist back in Sun and Moon, and so I think it makes sense that it was used here because prior your strongest options were like Shadow Claw and X-Scissor, both of which are pretty weak. And so it was that in 2022, Shedinja became a staple of some players for the duration of the season. One such player is Thomas Gravui. He brought Shedinja to one of the first regionals and finished second with it, using Kartana, Incineroar, and Thundurus to finish out his team. This archetype actually earned the name French Rain due to its popularity with a group of top French players, and continued to see success throughout the season. Thomas brought the same 6 Pokemon to European Internationals, where he finished 12th. From here on, he would continue to bring Shedinja to event after event, and even won a regional in Lille, where Shedinja also finished 4th and 7th, piloted by 2 of Thomas' countrymen. Thomas brought his team to the London Open, a regional level event that took place at the World Championships, where he finished 4th. He wasn't the only Shedinja player that year though. Shedinja won another regional, this time in the hands of Italian player Flavio Del Pidio. Flavio later brought his take on Shedinja, which featured Porygon 2 and Galarian Moltres, to the World Championships, where he finished 14th, the second best placing Shedinja, with the best one placing 9th. I think Shedinja is a fascinating Pokemon. It's this entire alternate win condition, giving players a goal that isn't knock out all of my opponent's Pokemon, and is instead knock out the ones that can threaten my bug. Maybe it's the Peristrap player in me, but I think that alternate win conditions are a good thing for the game to have. I think Shedinja also provides a strong counterpoint to the idea that centralization is entirely bad. A huge part of the reason why Shedinja was so strong is because of its matchup into the strongest restricted Pokemon. The high usage of Xerneas and Zacian opened the door for Shedinja to fill a niche that players otherwise couldn't afford. It's a good reminder that the more centralized the format, the more likely it is that a weird and wacky Pokemon can take center stage and shine. Of course, I think it may be a while before we can actually use Shedinja again. The real elephant in the room is that with terrestrialization, Shedinja can circumvent its weaknesses and its design, picking any type to transform into and making it much harder to pin down. Game Freak is clearly aware of this and intentionally left Shedinja out of Scarlet and Violet. And with champions also featuring terrestrialization, it might be a bit before we can use Shedinja again. Even still, I am sure that Shedinja will return one day, to remind us all that it's not our weaknesses that define us, but our strengths. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about the history of competitive Pokemon, I made a video talking about the single strongest team from Sword and Shield, which also happened to be the team that was dominating in 2022, the second year of Shedinja. Check it out.